Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Issei killed by Raynare in a world without Rias? Before I start, please do support for more awesome content, and subscribe my channel and like this video. If you like to hear adult version of this and other stories, I'll give you link of my Patreon. Go support and follow the Vergil Creiger for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story. Link in the description. Let's start this video. Once upon a time there was a perverted young man named Issei. Though good at heart, his age equaled the time he had spent without a girlfriend, until one day a beautiful girl he had never met before randomly confessed her love to him. Obviously it was a lie. The girl was a fallen angel who, for one obscure reason or another, wanted to kill him. Which she eventually did, with great relish. She lured him out to a secluded park, shoved a spear of light between his ribs, and left him to die. In one world, Issei was saved by a beautiful girl with red hair. He met a kind nun, a sensual demi-fallen angel, a lowly cat girl, a brave knight, a shy vampire, an exorcist with a spectacular magic sword, and his long-lost childhood friend, and together they would get up to mischief and adventures of all sorts. But what if all those people didn't exist? Then what? Would Issei then die, alone in the mud, without ever seeing another sunrise, without falling in love, without holding his first child in his arms, without growing old or seeing his grandchildren or experiencing life as he should? Would he die cold, betrayed, and alone? Yes, he would. Issei lay on the ground, bleeding. It was astonishing, he thought, how much blood was contained within the human body. He could no longer hear his own heartbeat, nor the sounds of breathing. It left the world around him horrifyingly quiet. Though the spear had burned to high hell, it didn't seem to have cauterized the wound, allowing for maximum leakage. It had also disappeared, which he had mixed feelings about. Though the burning was gone, it would have significantly slowed the rate of blood loss. He was dying. Fact. His girlfriend had been the murderer, and had laughed while she did it. He no longer cared, to be honest. But yeah, dying. A new experience, which is never good. It hurt, it was invasive, it had ruined his school uniform. First love bites. Issei had never really accomplished anything in life. He had never been good at sports, never been good at academics, never joined any clubs, never volunteered at special events, never learned to cook or play an instrument, never been popular or fallen in love, but he didn't regret it. He had one regret, and that was his family. He wished he'd said goodbye before he left the house that morning. Badum. Ah. Hello, old friend. Ba-dum-ba-dum. Despite its long absence, the sound was loud, strong. Ba-dum-ba-dum. It was slowing down. Ba-dum-ba-dum. All this time Issei had been lying on his back, staring vacantly at the night sky. Since he lived in the city, the bright lights obscured most of the stars. Now, even the trees and buildings in his peripheral vision had disappeared. He knew it was the end. Ba-dum-ba-dum. He imagined his mother, cooking at home. His friends laughing at school. His girlfriend, when they had first met. He felt himself start to cry. Ba-dum-ba-dum. I'm so scared. Ba-dum-ba-dum. I'm so alone. Ba-dum-ba. And then it was over. The sad form lay in the puddle, which was starting to turn from red to brown. Its hair and clothes ruffled in the cool wind, steam rose like a departing spirit from its gaping chest, and its body heat plummeted to the level of the chilly night air. There was no sound. Every bird and every beast had left for parts unknown, fleeing in instinctive terror from the corpse of Issei Hayabu, the man who should have been a hero, and the soul of a hero. That was a prize worth collecting in person. A shadow began to froth across the ground. The street lamps began to flicker off, one by one, as the darkness boiled upwards. The black tendrils coiled slowly, overlapping one another intimately, as a grim figure rose up. His skin was pale, bloodless, and wrapped tightly over bulging muscles. His lower body and arms were shielded by massive plates of rusty gray armor. Right arm to the elbow. Left arm to the shoulder. The torso was left bare, revealing scars innumerable, and a large azure gem glowed sadly from where it was embedded in his right pectoral. His hair hung to his shoulders, lank and oily and black. His face was covered by a near-blank bone mask. It reminded one of a skull, though without the cheery grin. The only openings on the ghostly veil were for the eyes, from which 2 points of glowing red shone forth. In his hand a scythe, huge, chipped, and unimaginably sharp. "Wake up, dead man." The corpse did not move, did not breath. Its heart did not beat, for it never would again. "Wasn't I supposed to be dead?" "You are." An experience, ironically, that I am unfamiliar with. Ah, Issei was dead, but he wasn't stupid. "You must be death." "Correct," whispered the grim figure. "Old age, predation, malnutrition, disease, suicide, murder. I am all these and more." "I see," murmured Issei. "So this is the end." "I am afraid so." For a while there was silence. Death and dead were still, their thoughts of a world beyond our own. "Why?" he understood. "Must there be a reason?" "No, I suppose not," sighed Issei. Death caught him by surprise then. "She did not kill you because of who you were, or because of anything you had done. She killed you because of what you could have been, what you could have done." "I was a nobody." "Yes, which was why she dealt with you then, in case you became a threat. You were born to be a hero, Deathling. A leader, a savior, a force which shaped the world, shaped history, and shaped the people around you. You were to do great things." Death fell to a whisper, a cold hiss on the wind. "So great that even I could not ignore you, which is why I would strike a bargain with you, dead man." For the first time since their conversation started, the corpse moved. Issei rolled himself over onto his stomach, then painfully pushed himself onto his knees. He knelt there, panting, blood soaked into his back and now his front also, a hole running through his chest. "I'm listening." "Change is coming," Death whispered. "Change so swift and so great that worlds will be swept away by its coming. Gods and demons shall rise and fall, even I am not certain I shall survive the onslaught. Which is why I find myself in need of some insurance. A weapon." Issei could see, partially obscured by his hair, those red eyes piercing into his soul. "A champion. Become my instrument, Deathling. Become my messenger, and everything you desire shall be yours. Life. Power. Vengeance. Anything. All I ask in return is your loyalty. Your loyalty, and your allegiance." The night was silent. Issei fought his way to his feet. Slowly. Painfully. His mouth twisted into a humorless, sardonic smirk. To an offer like that, there could be only one answer. "Go fuck yourself." Death stopped cold. "What? Power? Revenge? Life?" laughed Issei bitterly. "As if I need any of that. I only want one of those things, and something tells me you can't give it to me." "How dare you?" growled the Reaper. "Think of what you're turning down." "I know exactly what I'm turning down," Issei shot back. "Loyalty? Allegiance? You want my obedience. You want my servitude. You want me to murder in your name, that's all." In his mind's eye he saw her. Her eyes, her hair, her laugh as she tore his life away. He would never be like her. Never. "You ignorant flesh bag!" snarled the apparition. "Have you no idea of who you're dealing with? I am Death, the Grim Reaper, fourth and mightiest of the horsemen. You think you can insult me in such a manner, when I have given you an offer no mortal has been given before? You, an insignificant speck, who would have gone unnoticed and unmissed, were it not for I. Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? You are nothing, you hear me?" Nath. He was interrupted by a fist colliding with his face, so hard both mask and hand were shattered. "Don't take rejection well, do you?" Issei kicked him twice, once in the groin and once in the knee, already running as he toppled. The park was surrounded by a high wall, which he vaulted over at high speed, straight into a road thick with traffic. More than one car hit him, leaving streaks of his remaining blood across their windscreens, but he barely slowed. On the other side he did a standing jump, grabbing onto the edge of a handy fire escape and flipping himself up. He glanced over his shoulder. Death crashed through the wall, weapon a blur in front of him. The totaled vehicles left in Issei's wake were shredded like cottage cheese, diced into 2, 4, 8, into nothing at all. Issei scrambled up the side of the fire escape, ignoring the stairs for the sake of speed. The Grim Reaper followed, the escape crumpling like matchwood as he buled through, fists grabbing huge chunks of masonry, as he dragged himself upwards through upper body strength alone. Issei vaulted onto the rooftop. He was strong, he was fast, and he was agile for no apparent reason, but he couldn't stop to wonder why, because death was hot on his heels. Straight ahead was a river, forded by a huge metal bridge. A long cable connected the bridge with the roof he stood on, and that was what he went for. He took it at a running jump, the Reaper's scythe flying so hard and so close that he felt the wind pressure cut at his back. Instead, it severed the cable, just before Issei grabbed on. The dead man held on for dear life as the cord swung an incredible distance, miraculously failing to slam him into the side of the bridge. It was a moot point, however, as he was flung screaming into the path of an oncoming lorry. Death stood at the building's edge, glaring balefully as the truck jackknifed. A long, deep crack snaked across his mask from where Issei's fist hit home. "Minions," he rumbled. Red mist breathed about his ankles and materialized into slavering dog-like demons. Their heads, torsos, and limbs were hideously misshapen and distorted, and their saliva hissed on the concrete. "Take him down." The pack tore into action, baying for the dead man's blood. Issei was only just creaking to his feet, dizzy from the impact, as they caught up. As his vision steadied, he was already surrounded, the minions mounted upon crashed cars, crawling across the bridge supports or scraping along the ground. The pack leader crept forward. It was a huge specimen, the pale orange skin of its kindred replaced by a sickly green, and a coat of lethal spikes burst from between its shoulder blades. It lunged and he dodged, throwing himself out the way in a monumental leap to safety. Pulling itself out of the crater its impact had caused, the creature balanced itself on its smaller hind legs and began to swipe wildly with its huge forelimbs. Issei dodged each blow cleanly, backstepping smoothly and trying to use as little movement as possible. Eventually he saw his opening and jumped straight over the minion's head, higher than he had ever jumped before. He landed messily, rolling to a halt near one of the many vehicles that had been caught in the mayhem. A car, the door torn off, and a fat white man lying dead in the driver's seat. He was probably American, because strapped to his leg was the longest and broadest combat knife Issei had ever seen. He had barely torn it out of its sheath before his enemy was on him, spear tackling him in the abdomen and sending him skidding across the ground. The monster snarled, viciously trying to bite his head off. Big mistake. It should have used its claws. Issei drew the knife back and slammed it deep into the minion's shoulder, then yanked it out and slashed the wrist holding his right shoulder in place. His right arm now free, he attacked furiously, stabbing once in the chest and once in the throat. The creature reared back and he took his chance, using both hands to ram the weapon into the center of the monster's face. As he pulled the weapon free, his enemy pulled back and roared. A huge spout of blood gushed from the wound and Issei found himself buried beneath its overpowering bulk. He frantically kicked the weight off, desperate to escape, to survive. A futile hope, considering he was already dead. And then, impossibly, the minion stood up. It was groggy, weak, and with the same cold clarity he had had since life had abandoned him. He showed no mercy. Grabbing its arm, he began to pull, placing his foot against its shoulder for leverage. The monster squealed in agony and the tendons gave way, the limbs separating with a snap. Issei stumbled backwards, disoriented for a brief moment. And then he jumped, bringing the severed limb down like a gory club and crushing the monster beneath its weight. Exactly what it was that happened next, Issei couldn't be sure. What he saw was the severed arm turn gray, dissolve into tentacles of moving biomatter and assimilate into his body. The feeling it caused one of revolting invasion. His body, already beginning to decay, began to repair itself at the sudden increase in biomass. The broken hand, the shredded back, the results of being caught in 8 consecutive car crashes in the course of 10 minutes. All of it closed up and disappeared, though unfortunately the hole in his chest remained where it was. But that wasn't all. His flesh began to glow and flicker, as though unsure of its own shape. Not like a mirage, or the shimmer on a hot day. It literally, physically flickered, the disturbance surging across his body, focusing on his arms until, the change was so sudden it caused a small sonic boom, the air forced backwards by the explosive transformation. Issei's arms, from wrists to shoulders, bulged with skinless muscle. The color was black streaked with red, and various protrusions, like tubes, ridges or spines showed where the synthesis of man and monster was incomplete. Each hand was now triple the size of his head, and were each adorned with a terrifying set of claws. 3 fingers and a thumb each, They lacked bones or joints but rather extended into claws straight from the knuckle bones, long, curved, serrated, and sharp. Weapons made for killing. For battle, Issei targeted the minion closest to him and lunged with an animal roar, tearing it to ribbons with the first strike. Death watched darkly as the dead man slaughtered the remaining demons. This was not good. Despair! He barked, and despair answered. And lo, he rode upon a pale horse. As despair carried his master to the battlefield, Issei finished the last of the minions. With a swipe of his new claws, its arm went flying into the air, and as it stared stupidly at the stump, he leapt up, planted his feet on its shoulder, and decapitated it with a double swipe. At this point he noticed the horse, huge and powerful, its pale flesh rotting and decorated with bone armor. Its hooves, its mane, and its eyes all glowed with ghastly green fire, and on its back rode Death, his scythe held at the ready. Without hesitation, but not without fear, Issei charged. His inferior body weight meant his flying tackle was unable to knock the horse down, but it was not without effect. As Issei clung like a monkey to the horse's chest, it reared and neighed, leaving Death unable to attack for fear of killing his mount. The poor creature screamed as the claw plunged into its neck, sending its master flying for the first time since time began. As the huge creature fell, Issei stabbed a second time, pinning its throat to the concrete. After a few moments, the legs stopped kicking. Death and Deadman rose to their feet, each glaring steadily at the other. Issei briefly considered running, but the other being charged before he got the chance. Issei knew the incredible weapon in Death's hand would cut through him like a hot knife through butter, so trying to take him on in a head-to-head clash would be the equivalent of suicide. Instead, he backhanded with his right claw, striking the flat of the blade and redirecting its course, allowing it to embed harmlessly into the ground. His left moving in the same direction at the same time, Issei used the momentum to gash into Death's forearm, digging into it and completely cutting it off. His claws morphing back into human arms in a blur of red and black, Issei grabbed the haft of the scythe and yanked it out of the ground, bringing it round in a crushing arc, only for Death to grab it, blade first, with his remaining hand. With a flick of his wrist, the ungodly metal snapped. Issei staggered backwards, jaw swinging. That's not fair. Death grabbed him by the throat and lifted him clear off the ground. The world is unfair, boy. Death's severed right arm lifted of the ground, smoothly reattaching itself to its owner. You led me a merry chase, Deathling, but it looks like this is the end. The end? Smirked Issei. He was glad he no longer needed to breath, or else Death would be destroying his windpipe. Not quite. Oh, of course. I have yet to use my secret weapon, which, like all good secret weapons, Issei threw his head back dramatically. Comes from above. Death glanced upwards quickly, and Issei took his chance. Morphing his left hand, one long claw dug into Death's throat and exited through the crown of his skull. His grip loosened and Issei's legs came up, using Death's chest as a springboard, and inadvertently flinging himself off the side of the bridge. Death ran to the edge, his wounds already healed, but it was too late. He was gone. Death stood at the edge, eyes glowing behind his crumbling mask. He had strength, speed, reflexes, and agility several times what he had when he was alive. Death didn't care. His survival instinct was so strong, he could fight on par with entire packs of demons. Death didn't care. He was capable of assimilating other beings at a genetic level, taking on their strength, abilities, and physical characteristics. Death didn't care, for Death was drawn to life like a moth to a flame. One who was already dead, on the other hand. This man, this boy, had outrun Death. This he murmured, mask finally falling away to reveal the visage beneath. Has never happened before. Issei would be coming back from his first date soon, so she had made his favorite homemade chicken soup to celebrate. She had seen pictures of the girl on his phone, and was honestly surprised that her silly, perverted son had managed to bag such a hottie. She hoped the girl would treat him well. He was a moron and a shameless pervert, but he was still her son. It had been hard sometimes. Issei's father had died very suddenly, very suddenly, long before he was born, meaning she had to raise him entirely on her own. It hadn't always been easy, and he certainly wasn't perfect, but she loved him anyway. She wanted dearly for him to be happy. A crash echoed through the house as the front door was flung open. The sound was soon followed by a limp thud, a body collapsing in the hallway. The soup was dashed across the floor as she ran to the door. There a hole in his heart was Issei. All she could do was scream. Eventually one of the neighbors heard and came to investigate. They called an ambulance, but were unable to pry the frantic mother from her child. When they reached the hospital, the doctor gave her a strong sedative, and she knew no more. Her son, the doctors found, was a medical miracle. Whatever had pierced his chest had utterly incinerated his right lung, narrowly missing his spine. Excrement, blood, and undigested food sat immobile in their designated organs, all of which, even his heart, had stopped working. But his brain persevered, flickering with neural activity that never made it down his spine, and yet his body responded anyway. Through sheer habit he continued to breathe, the flow of air causing an odd whistling sound to come from the hole in his chest. When they took a sample of his blood, the wound continued to leak, very slowly, as his heart wasn't beating. It was this that was blamed when Issei's neural activity plummeted a few hours later. Their first solution was to give him a blood transfusion. Chaos ensued. Once the uproar had died down, they arranged for blood to be dripped continuously onto his bare skin, where it was immediately assimilated into his body. The places where their needles had penetrated closed up, and his brain returned to equilibrium. There was a certain unsteadiness to his brain waves, however, which they discovered was due to the second-hand nature of the donated blood. His skin excreted an odd toxin which lost potency mere nanoseconds after making contact with the air. It converted human cellular tissue into stem cells, absorbed them into his body, and used them to repair his constantly deteriorating innards. This, of course, was only a theory, of which only two things had been proven true. Firstly, Issei could process literally any human tissue. Skin, muscle, internal organs, you name it, and he ate it. He would probably eat people's clothes if you soaked them in enough blood beforehand. Secondly was that the fresher the tissue, the more easily he digested it, as they found at the expense of a particularly unfortunate hamster named Balthazar. The point is, all of this made the doctors at this hospital very excited indeed, in a manner which involved everyone shouting over one another and generally trying to assert that their theories and observations were better than anyone else's. They did this in the doctor lounge, a fair way down the hall from Issei's room. Apart from him, the room was empty, and of course no one had the forethought to ensure he was guarded. This made it very easy for the tall man in the trench coat and fedora hat to slip inside. "Hello there, Mr. Hodo," he smiled politely. "My name is Deathless." He sat next to Issei's bed and crossed one leg over the other. There was an empty glass sitting next to a jug of water, so he poured himself a drink. "So I hear I have to kill you," he observed after a few sips. "Bummer. Those eggheads down the hall seem to think you're the best thing since penicillin, by the way, so maybe that's not such a bummer after all. Better dead than locked up and experimented on, right?" Silence. "Right." He took another sip. "I don't know what makes you so special, but trust me when I say Raynare is the only one you need blame. Azazel, our boss, that has only wanted us to observe you. Raynare killed you because I don't know, she was jealous, I suppose? Because he was more interested in some kid who won the genetic lottery than in her." He began to turn the glass contemplatively in his hand. "Azazel, yes. You may have heard of him, you know, from the Bible. Did you ever read the Bible, Mr. Hayadu? Did you ever notice how in the Bible whenever God needs someone punished, or killed, or made an example of, he always sends an angel? Did you ever wonder what a creature like that must be like? A whole existence spent praising God, but with one wing dipped in blood. Would you really ever want to meet an angel?" Deathless finished the last of his drink, then moved to stand over his bed. Black wings spread from his back. "Like a crow. Well, guess what? I'm an angel. A fallen angel. One of the ones who became disillusioned and bit the hand that feeds. I kill firstborns while their mothers watch. I turn cities into salt, and when the mood takes me I rip the souls from little girls. And now I'm feeling guilty, not because I'm about to commit murder, or because you're just a kid, or because your mother is in the next room, or because your friends will be sad, or because. A spear of blue light manifested in his hand, and he held it threateningly over his head. It's because you'll never know why. He thrust the spear towards the sleeping man's face, and the blade was caught by a single hand. Thank you, Donsiege, whispered Issei. Wisps of smoke rose from where the spear was burning his palm. For giving me a name. His eyes opened, and Donsiege knew true fear. Raynare, the side of the hospital exploded. Lumps of concrete hurtled through air and crashed into the building on the opposite street, accompanied by myriad shards of glass from the windows. The 50 or so goons dressed all in black drew back as one, crouching down on their perch on the rooftops to avoid the shrapnel. Presumably, this meant the target had woken up. Everybody scatter, shouted Raynare from where she led the group. The target has escaped. Search the area around the hospital before he gets away. It was Donsiege who had survived the blast that found him first. He didn't know what had happened after Issei woke up, but the injured boy had let him live. Hadn't even touched him, as a matter of fact. It had been easy to track him, the dead man having only made a few blocks until he collapsed from the wound in his chest. He was slumped against the wall, seemingly unconscious, his hospital gown dirted in the mud. As soon as he saw him, Donsiege shoved a spear into his face. It carved through his skull like a hot knife through butter, sizzling into the wall behind him. He stood frozen for a moment, caught off guard by the anticlimactic kill. He allowed the spear of light to fizzle out and lingered awkwardly for a moment, somehow expecting more. He turned away. A pale hand pierced into his back and erupted from his chest. "I let you go once," was the last thing he heard as the area around the wound dissolved into gray biomatter. "You should have got the message." Moments later, a masked henchman walked into the alley. What he saw was Donsiege. He stood alone, holding his hands up in front of his face and regarding them contemplatively. "Sir?" said the goon hesitantly. "Did you find the target?" The fallen angel gave him an odd look, as though he were speaking a foreign language. "What was that, Lord Donsiege?" "Ah, I see." He nodded finally. He began to admire his reflection in a puddle. "So I look just like the fallen angel now, right?" The thug's eyes widened, and he hefted his gun. "You're not Donsiege." "No," agreed Issei. He grabbed him by the throat and slammed him headfirst into the wall. The crushed corpse was immediately assimilated, and Issei's appearance automatically altered itself to that of the man he had just killed. He patted the front of the black coat, but the wound in his chest still hadn't closed up. "Ha," he grunted. "Weird, I agree," said someone behind him. Floating a good distance off the ground were two more fallen angels. One was an attractive woman with an outfit that flaunted her large bust, while the other was a small, blonde goth loli. As soon as he spotted them, Issei went hurtling to the end of the alley, jumping clear over the wire fence onto the tarmac road beyond. There was no traffic, leaving him free to run as he pleased down the highway. This turned out to be very fast indeed, as his legs began to flicker with shifting biomass and empower him to speeds no human could hope to match. Ahead of him a car turned onto the road and began to drive towards him. Before he could change direction, a black helicopter swooped in from behind a building, launching a rocket at the oncoming vehicle. The missile hit it in the tail end, sending it flipping and screeching towards him. Unable to slow down at such velocity, Issei instead jumped straight towards the flaming ball of metal. He caught it firmly, but was knocked backwards by the superior weight. He landed on his feet and skidded backwards a few yards, before raising the wreckage clear over his head. The chopper opened fire with its machine guns, but the bullets just caused an annoying itching sensation as they passed straight through him, the injuries they caused closing up within seconds. With an animal roar, Issei hurled the car through the air. The helicopter simply dropped out of the sky as the blazing lump of steel hit it. It crashed to the ground with a sound like breaking glass, screeching across the ground for several feet before grinding to a halt. Issei briefly wondered if this meant he could take a rest before the chopper exploded, indirectly setting off one of its missiles. It went off against Issei's chest, flash-frying his front and sending him flying through the air. He rolled a bit before coming to rest on his back. He looked dead. He was. Raynare, along with the two lackey angels, floated to the ground. "Did we get him?" she snapped impatiently. "It's hard to say," said the older lackey subserviently. "The target seems to be quite resilient. Someone should go over and check," observed the blonde. Silence. A brief argument ensued over who should go over and finish the job. The dilemma was solved by the arrival of their minions, of whom Raynare chose 2 at random. The duo approached the corpse, guns at the ready. Though Issei had still been in the form of the grunt he'd killed, the horrifying burns and flame damage rendered him completely unrecognizable. Most of the clothing on his upper body had been incinerated in the blast, leaving the gaping wound next to his heart clear for all to see. The guns the grunts were holding shot bullets made of light and rapid fire, and Issei's body jumped and spasmed as the twin streams peppered his torso. After several minutes they ran out of ammo. "So that's it," said the little blonde angel nervously. "Is he dead?" The 3 fallen angels approached their target hesitantly. The older lackey gave him a tentative nudge with her foot, and all of them jumped back. Nothing happened. With renewed confidence she delivered a full-blown kick, the blonde stepping up beside her. "See, nothing to worry, Abio." Issei leapt to his feet, arms morphing into claws as he went. He grabbed a fallen angel in each hand and threw the older one to the ground, stomping on her brutally with his left foot. Her body was crushed, then immediately assimilated. The bullet holes closed up and the burns disappeared, but the chest wound stayed where it was. For the first time since she had murdered him, Issei saw his girlfriend's face. "Raynare," he nodded. "Issei," she nodded back. With the terrified blonde still clutched in one huge hand, Issei jumped for a nearby building. Channeling biomass to his legs, he began to run up the side, digging his feet into the glass and concrete, and using sheer strength to keep himself from falling. As he flipped himself onto the rooftop, 2 more helicopters rose up to greet him, but it did them little good. Issei grabbed one of the huge ventilation ducts with his free hand and threw it at one of the choppers, then immediately repeated the action for the second. But they had slowed him down, and Raynare was there with her army at her heels. Issei drew back and lifted one long, serrated claw to his hostage's throat. "Don't move," he warned, "or she dies." "Really now," smirked the dark-haired woman. "Is that a fact? You think I won't?" snarled Issei, and his claw dug into the blonde's neck. She whimpered and screwed her eyes up tight, a single teardrop leaking down her cheek. "I think you can't." The other girl laughed. "You were such a gentle boy before, Issei. So caring and thoughtful. It makes one wonder how you could be capable of such violence, such brutality. But then I thought, who isn't?" Her smile became even crueler, if that was possible. "What are the limits of what anyone would do, of who they would hurt in order to survive? So I ask you now, do you need to kill her to survive?" There was silence on the rooftop. Issei hooked his claw under the blonde's chin and lifted her head. She screwed up her eyes even tighter, and her whimpers became even more pathetic. Issei lowered his lips to her ear and whispered, "Sorry." He kicked her in the back, and she stumbled across the space between them and landed on her knees. She glanced over her shoulder incredulously, unable to believe she had escaped death so easily. Middlet called her superior, and she hurriedly stood up and ran to her side. Raynare smiled down at her, then turned back to her ex. "Well," she smiled. "What now? You killed one of my subordinates after all." "Not one," said Issei, and his body flickered. He retained his own appearance, but he was wearing Donasige's clothes. 2. Raynare narrowed her eyes, and likely would have ordered the attack were it not for what happened next. What exactly is going on here? Behind Issei had appeared a group of people his own age. Ridiculously, they were wearing his school uniform. There were 8 of them, mostly girls with one boy. Considering who their leader was, they were probably the student council. "What do you think you're doing in my territory?" snarled Sona Citri. "How many innocent people do you think have been killed already?" "Oh, relax," laughed Raynare. "We'll just kill this monster here, and then we'll be on our way." "Hayadu?" said the only male of the SC. "Is that you?" Issei gave him a hard look. He'd never met him before. "Yeah, it's me," he said gruffly. "Now I'm going to assume that, like everyone else I've met recently, you want to kill me." "What?" The boy looked shocked. "Why would you think that?" Sona eyed Issei's claws warily. She had a pretty good idea. "Because you're devils?" guessed Raynare sardonically. "Devils," sighed Issei tiredly. "Perfect." "Wait," said Middlet suddenly. When you say everyone I've met recently, do you mean people besides us? And who might that be? Said Sona, worried about more troublemakers on her turf. Well, said Issei, subtly shifting into a battle-ready position. Them. All hell broke loose. The deformed hellhounds had silently stalked across the surrounding rooftops whilst they were distracted, and by the time the attack came they were surrounded. Dozens of exorcists were slaughtered in the first few seconds, Raynare and Middle shamelessly using their underlings as human shields in the melee. Sona had reacted quickly, throwing up a barrier around her servants that pushed back any that attacked it, inflicted with burns far worse than Issei had received. The Deathling himself was a whirlwind, his claws leaving arcs of blood in their wake as he systematically took apart the assailants. His grace and skill were incredible, though less impressive if you happened to know it was all second-hand experience gained from the hounds he had already consumed. Issei instinctively flipped away from the point of battle, just in time, as a huge creature unlike any before it jumped out of nowhere, crushing the beasts that he had just been fighting. It possessed the same body structure as the hounds, with large, powerful front legs and smaller hind legs. Its skin was gray, like rock, and its face elongated into a snout rimmed with small, sharp teeth. Completing the look were a set of twisted horns and a long tail ending in a club. The creature roared towards him, head down so it could gore him with its horns. Issei waited until it was just within reach, then grabbed the natural weapons firmly with his claws. His feet skidded across the rooftop as the monster's superior weight pushed him back, the only thing stopping him being the raised edge. As his heels hit the edge, Issei tilted backwards, until he was hanging almost horizontally over the sheer drop. Desperately, he hung on to the creature's face even as it started trying to bite him furiously. Suddenly the monster's head jerked back, indirectly heaving Issei to safety. Just over the thing's shoulder he saw the boy from the SC. A length of glowing black thread extended harmlessly through Sona's barrier, connecting his right hand with the back of the beast's skull. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Issei drew back his claw and stabbed it mercilessly into the creature's bicep, causing it to crumple onto its chin. Seizing the opportunity, Issei pulled himself up, straddling its broad neck even as it regained its bearings and hauled itself to its feet. The monster began to rampage across the rooftop, lashing out wildly as Issei carefully directed it where he wanted it to go. When he finally jumped clear of the monster's back, it was just about to tear into what remained of Raynare's exorcists. By this point, all the hellhounds were dead save for the large one Issei had just been grappling. Sona allowed her barrier to fall, just as yet another black chopper rose up behind them. Issei sprinted towards them, allowing his claws to morph back into normal human arms. Just before he reached them, he jumped, sailing clear over them and slamming into the chopper with a biomass-charged kick. The helicopter crumpled lengthwise and flew backwards, exploding into flames against the side of the building. Not a moment after Issei landed, he jumped, soaring effortlessly over the gap and disappearing into the blaze. By this point, the fallen angels had managed to kill the alpha beast, its head rolling down to the street below, and its body pumping thick blood onto the ground. Raynare began to scream at her surviving underlings to attack, but Sona had already created a massive magic circle under her servants, teleporting them to safety. In the aftermath of the battle, Raynare and Middle stared across the gap at the now flaming building opposite. A man drew up beside them. He was human, with white hair and a white exorcist's coat. His name was Fried Zelzen. That, said Fried respectfully, was one badass mother of God. Elsewhere, Issei finally allowed himself to rest. He wasn't sure where he was, just that he was in a dark, cold place, and that he was alone. He curled into a ball, finally allowing the events of the last 2 days to catch up with him. How many innocent people do you think have been killed already? That was what Sona had said. People in the hospital, people in that car, people in the building he had kicked a helicopter into, people who died in the multitude of car crashes when this farce had started. He had caused people to die, people to suffer, people who would miss by other people who cared about them as much as his mother cared about him. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part, the absolute worst part, was that he knew he would allow it to happen again, because nothing. A girl walked down the street. She was wearing a dark brown button-up shirt along with a dark gray skirt that hung to just above her knees. Over them she wore a white apron with large frills at its edges which clung provocatively to her front. She was 16, and of average height. Her body was slim and attractive, the hips flaring gently before descending into her long legs. Her bust, considerable in its own right, was enhanced by the tight apron. Her hair was an unusual ash gray and remarkably soft, billowing slightly over her shoulders to finally end at mid-thigh. Her bangs framed her light blue eyes, set into a face that, while beautiful, was unnervingly deadpan. The ensemble she was wearing was the uniform for the bakery where she worked part-time. The establishment was set in a small side street, one of those places where small, friendly businesses gathered in clusters, where everyone knew each other by first name and everyone had their own batch of regulars. This bakery was the girl's destination. There was a quiet tinkle as the door swung inwards. The interior of the bakery was like the interior of a bakery anywhere else, but with an area to the side with tables and chairs for those who wanted to eat in. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman in a similar uniform was pulling a large tray of fresh bread out of a massive oven set into the wall. As she carefully set the tray on a waiting grill, she caught her employee's eye, immediately bursting into a grin. "Ah, morning. How are you? Did you wear that apron all the way here?" "I apologize, shopkeeper-sama," said the girl in a monotone. "But I was under the impression that this was the obligatory work uniform." From anyone else, the response would have been sarcastic. "It is, but you don't need to wear it all the way here. People will stare." "Why would they stare? It is a fairly common uniform." "Well, yes, but it may be a bit strange to see someone walking down the street in full costume." "I do not understand why it would be strange. I have been told numerous times that it looks good on me." "It did." "Unfairly so." "That's I just wait until you get here before you put the apron on, all right?" "As you wish, shopkeeper-sama." The girl nodded. "Good, now come over here and help me with these buns." Because of her utter lack of expression, no one really knew how much the girl truly loved working in that bakery. The smell of the place, the smiles of the customers, and the shopkeeper who was like the mother she never had, all of these things together made this her favorite place in the world. As she had yet to bake anything that was in any way edible, she spent most of her working hours operating the cashier. Only occasionally would she be allowed to handle the goods, works of art she desperately wished to create herself. That afternoon, a boy came to the store and bought some of their freshest bread. Though he was out of uniform, she recognized him from her school, as he was famous for being a shameless pervert. Despite his reputation, he barely looked twice at her, instead devoting his attention to the girl on his arm. She was quite beautiful, with long dark hair and a curvaceous body. Not so well endowed as herself, but still a fine figure of a woman. After they left, the shopkeeper commented on how out of place she looked, on a date as she was with such a nondescript boy. Good for him. As the sun was setting, the girl took some water left over from washing up and stepped outside. Sitting in front of the bakery were two large plant pots filled with decorative flowers, and it was a daily chore of hers to water them. As she made it out the door, a pungent, revolting smell assaulted her nostrils. Her nose wrinkled delicately, which was the equivalent of staggering backwards and vomiting for normal people. The odor, which strongly resembled that of stagnant sewage, was coming from a dozen odd black objects sitting in a heap to the side of the bakery doorway. They were spherical, but not perfectly so. The way they pressed against the ground and each other suggested their bodies had a squishy, fuzzy texture, an effect which was enhanced by the way they seemed to flop against the ground like partially deflated balloons. They were all black, reminding her of those dust yukai she sometimes saw in Studio Ghibli movies. A faint noise whispered out from the odd little things, and she squatted down to listen. "Water," came a tiny voice, somewhere between a squeak and a chirp. "Water." The girl blinked slowly, then poured a small stream from the watering can in her hands, trying to spread it equally over the various fuzz balls. With audible sighs, the creatures, for they were indeed alive, seemed to inflate as they absorbed the moisture like sponges, their outlines becoming smoother as their body mass expanded. They began to shuffle around, some of them hopping a few times so they weren't all lying in a heap. Each of them possessed two white dots on their front, resembling eyes. Regardless of their actual function, she assumed they were organs enabling whatever senses the things might have. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," they squeaked, bouncing cheerfully about her ankles. Even now, her face was devoid of expression. "Are you all right?" "Fine, fine, fine," they warbled, for some reason feeling the need to say everything 3 times. "Were you dehydrated?" The sun is hot, hot, hot. The girl glanced at the sky. It was actually pleasantly cool. What are you? Plants, plants, plants. You don't look like plants. Plants, 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 they insisted. Then were you photosynthesizing? Big word, big word, big word. Damn. What were you doing in the sun? Cleaning, cleaning, cleaning. In the sunlight? From the sewers, sewers, sewers. The girl blinked, an incredibly emotive expression of surprise. What were you doing in the sewers? Tasty, tasty, tasty. EW. You eat sewage? It make water clean, 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 but make us dirty, dirty, dirty. Huh. Fair enough. The girl cocked her head to one side as she considered the odd, smelly little squeakers. Absently, she poured some fresh water over them as she did so. They immediately stopped bouncing and shivered in pleasure. Nias layawady, it would have sounded sleazy were their voices not so adorable. She gave them a generous third helping, using up the last of the water. There is a park nearby. If you wish to sit in the sun in an area close to water, try the lake there. Without a word of goodbye, she stood up and walked back to the shop for a refill. Bye bye bye, they called after her. Every time they spoke it was in unison, with perfect synchronicity. But by the time she returned to water the plants, they were gone. Monday, when the girl woke up the next morning, it was to an empty house, as her father woke up particularly early each day to go to work. As she ate her morning toast, she turned on the news, which immediately began screaming at her about two horrific car crashes that had occurred simultaneously the night before. One had happened on a bridge a few miles away, while the other was right next to the park she had recommended to the strange little Watsits the night before. Despite knowing intellectually that they would have been inside the park, and thus nowhere near ground zero, her chest tightened slightly in dread. As per usual, she returned to her house after school. Her father still hadn't come back, so she promptly changed into her uniform and set off for work, this time with the apron rolled up and tucked firmly under her arm. The shopkeeper tried to tell her she meant the whole uniform, since she walked straight from her house, but gave it up as a lost cause. Despite the fact that she only worked part-time on weekdays, she encountered just as many customers as over the weekend. Though she didn't realize it, her beautiful face, voluptuous body, and unique personality made her popular. During a quiet moment, when she happened to look out of the shop window, she spotted a couple sitting at a table in the cafe across the road. One was a man, in his late 30s but still roguishly handsome. His hair was short and black with a single streak of gray across his brow. The girl sitting across from him could be clearly recognized as having been on a date with her classmate the day before. Her body language was enthusiastic and flirtatious. The girl beckoned the shopkeeper over, gesturing to the couple and quickly explaining the situation. The older woman's response was to pull out her phone and call the cafe's proprietor. Soon enough, their most attractive waitress arrived to give the couple their orders, promptly monopolizing the man's attention. The bakery workers watched in satisfaction as the girl became increasingly jealous, right up until she raised the first mouthful of food to her lips. What exactly had been done to her food cannot be recounted, for legal reasons, so we shall speak of the incident no more. After work, the girl asked if she could borrow the watering can, filling it with clean water before she left. Knowing her father was far too enthusiastic to notice if she was a few minutes late, she took a broad detour to reach the park. Though one side was cordoned off due to the horrific accident, it was still a simple affair to slip inside. She found herself walking down a long colonnade, a paved road with trees standing in uniform lines on either side. She walked past the fountain, which had a big, dark, suspicious, cordoned-off stain next to it, and followed a small side path to the lake. It wasn't a big lake, and may well have been considered a pond. The water was very clear, and there was no trash and no people. And try as she might, she could see no squeaky, smelly black fuzz balls bouncing by the water's edge. She stood there for a while, rolled up apron in one hand and full to the brim watering can in the other. Her face still blank, she turned and left. It was possible, of course, that they simply hadn't been there. Although if they had, and they'd been near the accident, then even the aftermath would have had enough people running around in circles to smush most of them beneath human feet. Even without that, the park was a popular spot. Dozens of people running around, unintentionally killing the pretty lady, pretty lady, pretty lady. Her shoulders relaxed. Turning around, she greeted them in her usual deadpan. Good evening. The little oddities had jumped out of the long sewage grates that ran parallel on either side of the road. There seemed to be more than last time, but there was more than enough water to earn ecstatic sighs from everyone present. All was right with the world. That lake looks clean. Tasty, tasty, tasty. It wasn't too dirty, was it? Dirty, 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 but we make clean, clean, clean for pretty, pretty lady. Thank you, she acknowledged. Was it hard work? We take break when people come. People? Boy and girl, girl and boy. A couple? Girl kill, kill boy, then fly, fly, fly away. The girl's heart went cold. What? Then big man come, the little things continued. His name Death, Death, Death. A man, she said slowly, the hand holding the watering can starting to shake slightly. Called Death? Big man come for boy, but he attacked by monster and monster run, run, run. Monster? Used to be boy. She blinked slowly. The boy became a monster? Had to, they burbled. Boy was dead, 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 and Death scary, scary, scary. I imagine he was, she agreed quietly. Even for her muted emotional state, these were some fairly shocking revelations. It was safe to assume that the disasters that shook the city the previous night had resulted from whatever chase that ensued. The tremors that suddenly racked her body soon faded away. She realized, after a while, that it did not concern her, nor hurt it. It was gone, it was over, and it wasn't worth losing sleep over. Why do you speak without punctuation? Big word, big word, big word. Feeling better, she gave them another dose of pure, cleansing water. Tuesday. The next morning, she once more watched the news over breakfast. This time there had been bombings. The victims had been a hospital, an occupied car, and an apartment building. In that order, the last one had seemingly been caused by an armed chopper crashing into it, with the smoldering skeletons of 3 identical choppers found on the streets nearby. The reporter called the incidents terrorist attacks and speculated that the accidents of the day before might be related. In turn, this made the girl wonder if maybe the boy/monster had found himself pursued once more during the night. The first explosion had occurred in the hospital room of an unnamed patient committed that very night, and everyone involved with the case had been found convenient casualties of the explosion. There was no mention of security tapes. At school, her perverted classmate had missed what was apparently his second day. She remembered both he and the boy/monster had been together with a girl on Sunday. Coincidence? Perhaps. Work was normal. There was no sign of the dark-haired girl. She returned the watering can, only to request it again after hours. She resolved to buy one of her own at the earliest opportunity. Now that she knew where to look, the fuzzy blobs greeted her quickly. There were less today, which she chose to pay no mind to. Pretty lady, pretty lady, pretty lady, they chanted, which she expected. Monster here, 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 they chanted, which she did not. She could, in hindsight, have walked away. The little fuzzies certainly weren't bright enough to judge her for it, and it would have, from a logical, at the time point of view, been far safer for her immediate health. But she went anyway. He was just lying there, slumped against the tree. He was a fair distance from the road, so it was understandable that no one had noticed him yet. His back was to the trunk, his legs splayed out in front of him, and his head lolled against his shoulder. He wore a brown trench coat that looked like he'd stolen it off someone, as it, along with the rest of his clothes, looked like it belonged on an older man. He was very pale, especially his lips, and what looked like long black cracks were creeping up his neck towards his face. Is he okay? She asked, then immediately wished she'd asked, is he lethal? He's hungry, 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 her companions chorused. Been scaring off the food, food, food. She was about to ask what they meant when nature answered her question for her. A large black crow, obviously hungry, swooped down on the sleeping creature and made to land on his shoulder, pecking aggressively at his chest. As soon as it touched him, his flesh began to swirl, become malleable, fluid almost. With a gurgle, the bubbling matter extended in fluctuating tentacles to bury themselves in the unfortunate bird's body. As the girl looked on in morbid fascination, the crow, dead before it could utter a sound, was converted from the inside out into the same creeping matter that had killed it, only to be absorbed into the sleeping man's body. After what had apparently been a meal, he had regained some color, and the cracks had disappeared. Only then did she recognize him as her missing classmate. So you mean to say he's been scaring off the birds before he can eat them? He's ashamed, came the oddly short reply. She was about to ask what they meant when she realized she already knew. Running from death, forced into this inhuman body. He disgusted himself. Hated even. He'll be fine with pretty lady. As the girl turned her head, she saw the little widows bobbing away across the grass. When she turned back, the thing was awake and staring straight at her, an inscrutable look across his face. The girl allowed herself to fall onto her backside, crossing her legs slowly. She deposited the can and apron on the ground, then placed her hands in her lap. They continued to stare gravely at one another. Considering how good I'm feeling, he said eventually. One of those birds must have gotten to me while I was asleep. A crow. She nodded. Another silence. So. You saw. I did. He closed his eyes and tilted his head back against the tree. Then why aren't you screaming and running? Because you go to my school. He flinched. It was an extremely peculiar sight, considering how terrifying he was. The thought made her pause. Was she scared of him? Yes. Yes, she was. You came into the bakery where I work on Sunday. She continued. With that dark-haired girl. She was, he grumbled, not meeting her eyes. My girlfriend. For the day, it seems. She was the one who killed me. Of course, she already knew this. Was she human? He seemed mildly surprised by the question. No, our awkward pauses were a lot less awkward when the one awkwardly pausing was so outwardly emotionless. Are you human? No. The admission seemed to take something out of him, making him deflate and crumple miserably. For most it would have given a sense of vulnerability, but for him it just gave her the erroneous feeling that he was rearing back to strike. What are you exactly? She asked curiously. Dunno, he grunted miserably. First I was alive, then I was dead, then suddenly I had the ability to eat people with my skin. People? He twitched. She almost flinched. Almost. A flicker of biomass blurred over his body, and suddenly he looked like a middle-aged man. Possibly the original owner of those clothes. This is Issei, he said, his voice now deeper and more mature. And now his skin, clothes and personality are accessories I can wear and remove at will. The girl blinked. There was a part of that sentence that sounded very ominous indeed. What do you mean by his personality? There was another disconcerting flicker, and he looked like her classmate again. I don't just assimilate flesh, but also memories. That's how I know that my ex was a fallen angel, as were two other people I ate last night. He had an oddly satisfied smile on his face as he said this. A chill crept up her back. I'm afraid this doesn't make sense, she said stoically. Up until a few days ago you were just an ordinary high school student. You cannot simply become capable of fighting on par with the horsemen of the apocalypse overnight. His eyebrow twitched, and for a moment he looked oddly offended. Death sent a few hellhounds after me on that first night, he grumbled. Through luck, instinct, and sheer desperation I managed to kill one. Its fighting experience was pretty useful. It also allowed me to do this. His left arm morphed into a grotesque, muscular claw. He raised it slowly so that one long talon was pointing at her forehead. Why didn't you run when I woke up? Even for her, keeping her composure was difficult. You can probably run faster than me. True. He nodded. How did you find me? She was starting to sweat. The sewer yokai showed me. Are you serious? They were dying by the side of the road, and I saved them. Now they love me. So you're just an innocent bystander? I find that hard to believe. She wondered what had happened over that past 2 days to make him this way. It's not that unlikely. You were rather calm when asking me questions. The claw was now touching her forehead. And you started fishing for information pretty quickly. I was just curious. Really? The pinprick on her forehead was starting to hurt. We'll see about that. He removed his claw, and at its tip hung a single bead of blood. Numbly, she reached for the spot he had touched. Her hand came away red and shaking. Eyes closed, he caught the drop of blood on the end of his tongue. After a brief moment his eyes reopened. Fine then, bystander-san, he said reluctantly. Is there anything else? She asked the one question that had been on her mind since he woke up. Are you going to kill me? No, he said quietly, a touch of shame in his eyes. Then in that case, I have something to say, she murmured. Internally, she began screaming at herself to shut up. Any of those people that tried to kill you over the past few days deserved their peace. You shouldn't feel guilty for killing them. His eyes widened and he looked like he was about to speak. She cut him off. But a lot of innocent people died because of you. Because you ran. You need to take responsibility. There was a long silence as he simply stared at her. When it became clear he wasn't going to speak, she picked up her watering can and her apron, rose to her feet and made her exit. If she wasn't so conscious of his eyes on her back, she would have missed his forlorn murmur of, "Thank you." Later that night, "Well, Saji Nimura," said Sona. "I'd intended for tonight to be your first taste of demonic combat, but I suppose after yesterday's incident it'll be a little lackluster." They were in an abandoned building at the edge of town, which apparently housed a rogue devil. Sona was walking at the head of the group while her pawns walked a step behind her, the better to hear her explanation. Shinra, Yura, and Meguri took up the rear. Saji was actually rather glad of the exercise, as the idea that such a friendly, honest person as Issei Hayato could become that had been haunting him since the previous night. "Have I told the two of you about the evil piece's abilities?" Sona asked rhetorically. "I can explain best if we start with 3 general categories: Rook, Knight, and Bishop. Each one of these pieces enhances one physical attribute. Bishops, for instance, have greater affinity for magic, which is why Kusaka and Hanakai are handling the barrier to keep the rogue in place." "I see," a voice hissed sibilantly from the darkness, scaring Saji out of his skin. "So that is why I was unable to escape." The first thing Saji saw as the rogue stepped out from the shadows was the upper body of a voluptuous naked woman. The second thing he saw was the giant furry panther body she had below her waist. The third thing he saw was the tail, long and prehensile with a large hooked blade attached to the end. "Ah, great timing," nodded Sona calmly. The 3 girls compromising the rear guard launched themselves into action. "As I was saying, next is the Knight. Their power lies in their unmatchable speed. Faster than the eye could follow, the rogue's tail flicked dexterously forward, twisting through the air to attack time and time again from different directions. Meguri's sword was a blur, deflecting the blade with awe-inspiring precision. As the tail was occupied, Yura lunged in low. "The power of the rook is incredible strength," continued Sona. "Considering this grants them the secondary ability of powerful defense, they are considered to be worth slightly more than bishops or knights." As Yura drew in close, the rogue lifted one massive paw and brutally slammed it down, tile and concrete exploding outward as she was crushed into the ground. For a moment Saji thought the devil had actually killed her, before the rogue's foot was slowly forced upwards by the crouching rook. With a twist of her wrist, Yura threw the heavy paw to the side, before punching the creature right in the middle with a devastating uppercut. The surprised rogue was launched straight into the ceiling, only to crash straight through into the rooms beyond. Back at ground level, Yura was forced to cross her arms in front of her face to shield herself from the rain of debris. The rogue must have regained its bearings first, as twin streams of viscous green fluid shot forth from the ruins. Before Yura could take any damage, Shinra was there, slamming the shaft of her naginata into the ground to flip up a lump of masonry as a shield. The liquid hit the barrier and ate it away like acid. "The queen, as you can see, possesses all possible attribute bonuses," smirked Sona. Saji barely heard her, as he was getting into the spectacle. However, Tsubaki only really uses her bishop powers in conjunction with her sacred gear. The rogue stuck her head back into the room, her beautiful face now distorted into a bestial, demonic visage. Her fang maw gaping, a massive orb of purple demonic energy began to form between her jaws. With an animalistic, high-pitched shriek, the bullet of demonic power tore through the air, the stationary Shinra its target. "Mirror Alice!" she shouted. For the second time the rogue devil's attack was blocked, this time by a gigantic ornamented mirror. The glass glowed brilliantly for a moment as the blast was absorbed, then blazed with color as the wave of power was reflected right back into the surprised devil's face. This time the entire rear end of the building was blown away, the power of the attack doubled by the effect of Shinra's sacred gear. For a moment they stared at the colossal hole in the wall, partially obscured by drifting smoke. A shockwave of magical energy rippled through the room, a demonic dissonance that was sensed rather than felt. It came from the opposite direction to which the rogue had disappeared. What the hell was that? Scowled Sona. A small magic circle for the purpose of communication appeared by Sona's head. What is it, Hanakai? Kai-cho! Came the desperate scream. Something's trying to break through the barrier. Something powerful. Before she could respond, the rogue erupted from the smoke, most of her front reduced to scorched scar tissue. Distracted by Hanakai's call and her sacred gear still in its cooling period, Shinra was unable to react before she was backhanded into a wall. It's breaking through. I can see it. I can. Yura, judged the next greatest threat, was attacked second. The rogue slammed its front paw into the ground and caused the floor to splinter. Her footing destroyed, Yura couldn't defend herself as the enemy's tail crashed into her. The power of the rook stopped the blade from penetrating her skin, but it was enough to knock her out. Run! You have to run! He'll kill us all. Meguri's mistake was to stop and reach into her pockets for the Onmyo talismans her family specialized in. The rogue simply grabbed a hold of her arm while she was distracted and tossed her over her shoulder. Please don't kill me. Please, En. Hanakai's call was abruptly shut off. For Saji, it almost seemed to happen in slow motion. The devil charged towards them, Sona and Nimura only just beginning to act. He felt a numb sense of surprise as he watched his body act of its own volition, flinging his master and fellow pawn to safety. He watched as the monster slowly bore down on him, absently summoning his sacred gear, before the wall behind him exploded inwards, as Issei Hayata plunged feet first into the room. His whole body flickering with shifting biomass, the force behind the ridiculous flying kick that connected with the rogue's jaw was enough to send her hurtling, for the third time, through the opposite wall, or it would have, if there was any wall left. Landing gracefully on his feet, Issei calmly turned to face him. This is really embarrassing and all, he said, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. But I'm afraid I don't remember your name. Huh? Said Saji intelligently. Oh, Saji. Genshiro Saji, right. Just wanted to thank you for helping me against the monster yesterday. Appreciate it. He glanced over his shoulder. Sorry, but I haven't had a decent meal in a while. Is it okay if I eat that ugly lady back there? Saji glanced at his master, who was staring at the discussion with a look of unabashed incredulity on her face. She winced but nodded. Sure. Go for it, thanks. Further conversation was cut short, as the rogue devil's tail whipped out from the darkness and impaled the dead man through the chest. Showing no signs of pain at his injury, Issei grabbed the appendage and pulled, yanking her clear off the ground and swinging her through the air. As Issei swung the creature in a circle, her body crashed through the building's remaining walls, taking out the support and causing what was left of the ceiling to collapse. Using the momentum already built up, Issei swung the monster upward, using her as a flail to batter the falling building out the way. Let go at the last second, her arc continued skywards, as Issei morphed his arms into claws beneath her before leaping in pursuit. He passed her as she descended, and at first it seemed she had escaped injury. A crater was formed as she crashed face first into the ground, and a moment later Issei himself landed a few feet away. Clutched in his claws were the rogue's severed front legs. He crushed them mercilessly, and the wound in his chest healed as the fresh meat was consumed. Huh! He blinked as the memories were assimilated. You shoot acid out of your seriously? The devil took advantage of his distraction, rearing up on her hind legs and opening a huge, fanged, vertical mouth on her abdomen. Before he could even scream, the dead man had been swallowed in one bite. For a moment the rogue allowed herself to shriek with victorious laughter. The first hint that Issei was still alive was when the laughter turned into screams. The second was when her flesh began to bubble and turn gray, tendrils of biomass piercing in and out of her body. Her face was the last to go, contorted into a rictus of torment before being abruptly silenced and melted, collapsing with the rest of her body to be absorbed by an entity far more terrifying than she. There is a difference, of course, between a monster and a monstrosity. As Issei emerged, perfectly unhurt, from the whirlpool of liquid flesh, his first words were, "Now that's one ability I'm never going to use." When he turned, it was to see Sona and her entire peerage staring him down. Besides Saji, they all seemed rather hostile. So, said Issei, a touch awkwardly. Devils, huh? Will you please stop looking at me like that? sighed Issei. Kusaka and Hanakai both flinched. Issei was sitting in the student council room, headquarters, as he would come to refer to it in his head, in Ku Academy. He had a sofa to himself, while Saji sat opposite him. Sona sat at an immense desk perpendicular to where he was sitting, while the rest of the devils stood at attention around the room, as though standing guard, except for the bishops, that is, who were cowering in the corner as far from him as they could get. Although he still hadn't noticed it, a creepy whistling sound came from the hole in his chest every time he breathed. It put everyone in the room on edge, and the moments when he stopped breathing entirely, since he technically no longer needed to, were frighteningly tense and silent. Sona blinked back to reality. She had been staring off into space at the sound of Issei's voice. Because speaking was essentially a glorified form of exhaling, Issei trilled whenever he spoke. It underlined everything he said, giving an inhuman tone to each word. "You told me you didn't do anything to them," she remarked, trying to regain control of the situation. "I didn't," insisted Issei. She noted the trill became higher pitched with exclamatory remarks and lower when he was being declarative. "Maybe they were just intimidated by the way I broke through their barrier?" Hanakai ran to the window, threw it open, stuck her head out and began to vomit noisily. Kusaka dropped to her knees and began sobbing into her hands. "How did you break through?" Saji wondered aloud. Issei shrugged. "You saw me regenerate earlier, right? Well, I just relied on that and pushed straight through." Kusaka, who had just been pulling herself together, managed a single horrified look before her eyes rolled backwards, tipping sideways in a faint. Hanakai was no longer blowing chunks, but had collapsed to her knees and was resting her forehead against the windowsill. "It was horrible," she croaked. He just dissolved into this fleshy writhing thing. I would like to point out that I have no idea what she's talking about," Issei interjected. "Mostly because my eyes were the first things to burn out." Mimura gave him an unsettled glance. "Didn't that hurt?" Issei trilled thoughtfully. "No. Actually, I don't think I feel pain at all." He paused. "Maybe it was something like H.P. Lovecraft. When I scared your bishops, I mean. Like how staring Cthulhu in the eyes drives mortals insane." Sona raised an eyebrow. "Are you comparing yourself to the Cthulhu mythos?" For a long moment, Issei just looked at her. "I don't think I've read any of Lovecraft's books, or even heard of him in my life. I probably just inherited the memory from someone I ate." His flesh suddenly rebuilt itself into the image of Don Siege. "This guy. I think." Hanakai hit the floor with a thud, joining Kusaka in blissful unconsciousness. "All right then," swallowed Sona. She had ordered Shinra to take the bishops home, and was now clasping her hands over her desk to keep them from shaking. "I admit you are slightly Lovecraftian." "Just now," interrupted Issei. "I used the word inherited. I would usually never do that. I also think I've gotten smarter than I used to be." The whistle from his lung dropped to a low croon. "I think the personalities and IQ of the people I consume are starting to bleed into my own. Like devouring them doesn't kill people, just assimilates them into a hive mind controlled by the body they inhabit." He blinked as a thought occurred to him. "At least I assume I control them. Maybe I value the persona of Issei Hayato because he was here first. Maybe he'll slowly disappear as more and more souls are added into the mix, swallowed by the sea of identity. Maybe that's already happened." Saji gave him a look that held more worry than fear. "Isn't that scary? I died last Sunday." "This is nothing." An enormous blue magic circle bearing the insignia of House Citri suddenly appeared in the middle of the floor. Issei leaped to his feet and morphed his arms into a terrifying set of claws, sending the sofa flying. The rapid movement was made all the disconcerting by the sudden disappearance of his signature trill. "What the shit is that? Summoning circle. Calm down." It was Yura the Rook who reached the formation first, reading the intentions of the person on the other side through a method Issei could not imitate due to not eating enough devils. "Yet. It's not one of our regulars. Must be a new guy." "Is that all?" frowned Sona. "Saji. Deal with them quickly, then come back here." "What?" Not just Saji but also everyone else in her peerage looked alarmed by this command. But shouldn't I? That's a pretty ballsy move considering he's the only reason I vaguely trust you guys. Issei grunted. He righted the sofa, having returned his arms to normal, then dropped into it gracelessly. I have confidence that you will not kill us if unprovoked, declared Sona, adjusting her glasses with one hand. Even if you are the scariest thing I've ever seen. Issei cocked his head, his whistle starting up at a croon. Thank you? I appreciate your honesty. With one last backward glance, Saji stepped into the portal, vanishing to places unknown. Why do you trust him? Asked Nimura curiously. Meguri quickly dragged her back so she could whisper something about not pushing their luck. Issei just smiled. Because he committed an act of instinctive kindness. It's the most trustworthy form of kindness there is. Yura frowned. I don't understand. You will. Glancing at the student council president, Issei trilled thoughtfully. Just so you know, I'm in this state due to some asshole trying to resurrect me as his demonic slave. If you try to pull anything similar, I'm going to be very upset. Sona discreetly pushed closed the drawer containing her evil pieces, which she had been waiting for an opportune moment to pull into the conversation. Wouldn't dream of it. With Saji. In a flash of blue light, Saji emerged into the client's house. The room was quite dark, so it took a moment for his vision to adjust after the glow faded. As his devil night vision asserted itself, he saw himself to be in a generic living room, just like pretty much every other place he had been summoned to. The client was reclining on the sofa and smiling invitingly up at him. The man was middle-aged but handsome, with dark eyes and dark hair tied into a ponytail. Hello? He greeted. You must be one of these devils I've heard so much about. I must say, I'm rather disappointed. I half expected a chorus of ominous Latin chanting. We don't do that anymore, joked Saji. We kept getting noise complaints from the neighbors. He got a mellow laugh in return. He cheered internally at getting such a laid-back client. Quite obviously, this was going to be a piece of cake. Just outside the house, Fried glared crankily at his phone. It had a GPS app booted up and a marker over his current location. If this thing sent me to the wrong place again, then I swear to God. Back at headquarters, Sona was doing that odd thing people do where they steeple their fingers like a bridge and stare over them at you as a way to hide their mouth. With great resignation, Issei acknowledged she was still afraid he may try to kill her. I'm sorry, but that's a bit hard to believe, she was saying. That is a really obvious trick, which is exactly why he fell for it. Issei was swilling an untouched cup of tea in his hands, wondering if he was able to digest it. Because the obvious is too obvious, people tend to expect the unexpected. In expecting the unexpected, they fail to expect the obvious, thus making it obvious that the obvious will always take the other party by surprise. Even a horseman of the apocalypse. What? Once again the magic circle suddenly appeared, this time flashing brightly with an obnoxiously loud siren in the background. Once again Issei lunged to his feet, claws out and couch flying. Fuck. What the fuck? Calm down, sighed Yura, who had decided Saji was right and he wasn't dang and that he wouldn't hurt them. She placed her hand on the glowing patterns, frowning as information filtered into her brain. Something's wrong. It's Gen-chan. He's off the grid. Immediately the whole room was paying attention. What happened? Demanded Sona. Issei stepped back as the girls crowded around the magic circle. I think it must be one of those obstructive barriers the Grigori use. Gen-chan is probably trapped inside with an exorcist. Or worse, a fallen angel. What? Issei's mind struggled to reboot. Saji was in trouble? Was he hurt? Dead? Worse? The gray-haired girl's words flashed through his mind. He remembered all the people that had died because of him. Was it happening again? Would this keep happening as long as he existed? Would no one be safe? He had to help. He had to do something. But how? Sona and her team were far more experienced than him but still came up with nothing. So he should just sit here. He should just sit on his ass as Saji died and do nothing. The hole in his chest suddenly contracted. A wave of sensation burst outwards as it suddenly spasmed, passing through his chest, up his throat, past his eyes. It was gone. What the foo dash? And now it was back again. It brought with it a bizarre, instinctive knowledge of a direction. From the direction the sensation had bounced off something important, and now he knew exactly where it was. As Issei floundered in confusion, the sensation left his body a second time, and a second time the direction appeared in his mind. Clearer than before, it was like a sonar, but not, because a sonar used sound, and this wasn't sound, this was something different and alien, and it was like a sonar, like a bat finding prey in the dark, like a dolphin seeing predators in the ocean. He knew where Saji was. Damn it! Cursed Sona. Look, Hayadu. We've got an emergency here, so we're going to have to save our talk for another time. She went straight back to her post. If she turned, she would have known she'd been talking to empty air. Meanwhile, the exorcist laughed maniacally, tearing apart the living room with his firearms. Saji just cursed, ducking behind the sofa with his client. I'm terribly sorry about this, he said nervously. Oddly, he wasn't that scared. Compared to the monsters that had attacked when Issei had fled the hospital, well, Freed just wasn't a big deal. Usually forming a contract is a zero-risk process. I have no idea why he's bothering us now. That's quite all right, smiled his client. It's nice to have exciting nights like this from time to time. He was certainly easygoing. What's wrong, shitty devils? Shrieked Freed, who had switched to a light-powered SMG. You afraid? You know, it was awfully nice of him to stop and introduce himself, said the client suddenly. If he'd just taken us by surprise, we would probably be dead already. Some people are just weak in the upper story, shrugged Saji. As if on cue, Issei showed up. He stood on a neighboring rooftop, scowling at the house the direction had led him to. Though it looked fairly unremarkable, bouncing the sensation off of it revealed a metaphysical dome. Though he would usually force his way in as he did with the Citri barrier, the fallen angel's memories told him that such things were usually upheld by a team of support exorcists. If he could take them down, then the barrier would go with them. But first he needed their location, their direction if you will. There were 5 of them crowded in an alley on the opposite side of the road. They were wearing black masks, black hats and black trench coats, just like the exorcists that attacked him the other night. Though their guns were out and at the ready, they stood relaxed, which made it easy for Issei to sneak up at them. They were talking as he approached. But isn't that a little unfair? One of them was saying. It feels like we're excluding him. Damn right we're excluding him, responded another. If he's that crazy when sober, can you imagine what he's like when he's drunk? I saw him drunk once, offered a third. He cut off the bar girl's head and raped the corpse. Then he killed the patrons when they tried to pull him off. Maybe we should go without him. This was the first man again. He glanced at the Devil Summoner's house. But seriously, what's taking him so long? I thought Freed was some kind of badass. He's probably just screwing around. You know what he's like. Issei searched through his stolen memories. Freed Zelzen was a prodigy, a born fighter. He had been excommunicated for his perverse brutality, and generally being batshit insane. He had an impressive record when it came to killing devils, while Saji didn't inspire a whole lot of confidence as an ass-kicker. Shit. Issei cursed. The exorcists immediately turned at the sound. HM? What was Dash? When they saw Issei, still wearing Donasige's clothes, all parties froze. So much for stealth, said Issei, genuinely embarrassed. His arms morphed into claws. Oh well. He charged forward, running one of the exorcists through with his right hand before he had an opportunity to react. Yanking it out again, he spun on the spot with the same movement. His claws ripped open the chest of the second just as the remaining 3 began to open fire. Ignoring the harmless light bullets, Issei kicked a third man into the air before jumping after him and slicing him in half. The attack had been meant to inspire awe and hesitation, but failed. The 4th exorcist charged him with weapon screaming. Issei grabbed him by the head, crushed it in his hand and tossed the remains over his shoulder, where he smashed with a wet snap against a car. The last man had gotten some distance, and pulled out a grenade launcher, which he began to fire recklessly in Issei's general direction. By the time the first shot was halfway to his original position, Issei had already run past it, one hand coming down in an overhead swing. One claw went either side of his neck, cutting through his ribs and finally stopping in his gut. When Issei pulled it out again, he flopped awkwardly to the ground, his torso in 3 pieces. Knowing the barrier was down, Issei allowed himself to relax. Hey guys. I've got a message for what the fuck. When telling this story later, Issei would remark that the Grigori must really cherish their messengers if they gave them bazookas as standard issue. The shell caught him unprepared, exploding against his chest and sending him flying backward into a brick wall. The messenger exorcist eyed the black smoke, cringing at the grisly remains of the dead man's victims. He knew this meant that the barrier was down, open to invasion by the devils. He hurried toward the house, not noticing the pillar of flesh rising from the smoke. Before it even finished reforming into human shape, it lunged for his back. Meanwhile, Sona and her crew warped in as soon as the barrier dropped. Don't worry, Saji. We're here to. Clearly, she had been expecting something different. At one end of the room, Saji and his client had gathered around a coffee table. They were playing a card game of some kind, had half-empty root beers at the ready, and were now staring at her in mild surprise. The rest of the room was a network of black threads created by Saji's sacred gear, entrapping an angry white-haired man in clerical clothing. He had at some point dropped his weapons and accidentally kicked them to the edge of the room. He was now thrashing and swearing violently, but only seemed to making his entanglement even worse. What Sona had very clearly been expecting something different. In fact, she felt an irrational surge of anger at her pawn for making her worry without cause. Kaicho! He cheered excitedly, leaping to his feet. I knew you'd break through that barrier eventually. The look of starry-eyed faith he gave her diffused any negative feelings. She resolved not to tell him the obstruction had simply disappeared on its own. Oh right! I almost forgot. Kaicho, this is my new client, Mr. Thade. Oh, yes, stammered Sona, struggling to regain control of the situation. It's nice to meet you. Likewise, nodded the dark-haired man. He glanced at the struggling exorcist. Is he starting to slow down? That would be my sacred gear, absorption line, said Saji helpfully. It's been draining his energy since he first made contact. I see, mused the client. For a moment they listened to the man's exhausted cursing. His stamina is quite impressive, isn't it? Abruptly, a door at the other end of the room, behind the network of threads, was blown off its hinges, a troop of black-clad exorcists forcing their way through. Freed! We were sent to reinforce you when your team's life signs. What the crap? Freed continued to swear as the two sides faced each other. Mr. Thade took a swig of his root beer. It should be noted, at this point, that Sona's bishops were absent due to sleeping off their PTSD. Though this placed the Citri peerage at a numerical disadvantage, she would later reflect that this was probably a good thing. Considering what happened next, an exorcist, younger than the others, stumbled into the room. He was crying, his left arm was a ragged stump, he had vomited across his own chest and, when he turned, Sona could see huge chunks had been gouged out of his back. Sergeant! He sobbed, almost collapsing into the leader. We have to run, get back up something. What happened? The lead exorcist kept one eye on the devils as he cradled his junior. Who did this? Issei Hayato, his blood froze. I found him where the barrier squad was supposed to be. The messenger continued. He didn't even eat them. He just tore them to pieces, so many pieces he was now screaming hysterically. I shot him with a bazooka. A fucking bazooka. And he just got back up again and tried to kill me too. I only just escaped. Stay with me, snarled the exorcist. What about Hayato? Where is he now? I don't know, whispered the messenger, barely clinging to consciousness. One moment he was chasing me, taking chunks out of me, the next he was gone. His breathing had slowed down drastically. Maybe he went after someone else. The room had gone quiet. Even the devils were disturbed by Issei's cruelty. He tortured him. This was Meguri speaking. He tortured him. For no reason. That's why would he? What if he's already here? One of the exorcists interrupted. What if he infiltrated our group already? The air froze. The mooks began to exchange looks nervously. Maybe we should call. No, grunted the leader, lowering the messenger's corpse to the ground. If we do, and the Lady Raynare choose to come to our aid, then there is a risk she may die at the hands of the shapeshifter. It is more than our lives are worth. Shame. The leader gave a strangled choke, spitting blood across the floor. The messenger casually rose to his feet, the enormous claw he had shoved through his superior's chest lifting the larger man clear off the ground. I really wanted to kill her. The man gave one last gurgle before Issei consumed him, his body dissolving and assimilating into the dead man's chest. When he came back to his own form, Issei was wearing Donasiv's clothes, as he had become accustomed to them over the past 12 hours. The remaining exorcists could only stare in horror. Any last words? Asked Issei politely. The couldn't respond, frozen at the sight of the creature feeding. No? All right then. He got all of them at once, morphing his arms into claws and bringing them together in an enormous bear hug. The combined mass of the thugs eclipsed his own body as it swirled about, writhing like a living thing before being absorbed and digested by the Lovecraftian horror. All of a sudden, Sona understood what had her bishops so afraid. The group tensed as Issei turned to face them, and the black threads suddenly disappeared in response to Saji's quivering nerves. The white-haired man, long since out cold, fell with a dull thud to the ground. Issei folded his arms. I think you owe me an apology. Sona blinked. What dash? I would never, snarled Issei, pointing at the alarmed Meguri as he spoke. Commit a willful act of torture. Just because I'm suddenly trapped in a body that needs living flesh to feed doesn't mean I'm immediately going to turn into a sociopathic monster. In fact, I am insulted by the implication. Meguri began to babble in surprise. That's I mean. I would think that being a devil, you of all people would understand. Sona saw the pinched look in his eyes, and recognized it as someone about to cry. She realized, with no small amount of shame, that they had genuinely hurt his feelings. This time the whole peerage flinched. They had all been on the receiving end of racial discrimination at one point or another. I'm sorry, murmured Meguri. Her head was bowed with genuine regret. Yeah, you should be, growled Issei, but nevertheless appeared to calm down. He turned brusquely on his heel. Let's just get out of here. I think those guys gave me, and a human hand pierced his back, exploding from his stomach in a shower of gore. Gestion. Issei glanced down at the foreign appendage. Issei's upper body exploded. Lumps of ambiguously colored flesh splattered against the walls and ceiling. The sight made all the more gruesome for the unsettling lack of blood. Issei's lower body stood where it was for a moment before toppling slowly to the ground. The devils stared in shock. Wow! Murmured Mr. Thade, looking down at the matter still coating his hand. That was easy. What? Things were happening too quickly, one after the other. They couldn't keep up. That why would you? Oh, this? The dark-haired man waved off Saji's question. This was just business. Nothing personal, you understand. He shot a look at Issei's remains. I admit, however, I didn't expect to find him so quickly after making contact. Just lucky, I suppose. Sona figured it out first. So what you're saying, she growled, surreptitiously preparing a teleportation spell as she did so, is that you only made contact with us so you could get to Issei Hayate. The client nodded with a cheerful grin. Correct. What? Saji shot her an alarmed look. But we barely know him. Why would dash? Ah, but you forget. Thade wagged his finger, as if at a child. Was it not you, young Genshiro, who saved him from my pets? For someone as desperate and lonely as him, of course he would latch on to you at the earliest opportunity. This, he gestured at the dead meat scattered across the room, is all thanks to you. But Sona really wanted to comfort him, but she had bigger problems. Who are you? Asked Saji finally. Think, Saji, snarled Sona. Who is the one person that wants Hayate dead more than anyone else? At last, her peerage tuned into how the situation was affecting her. To say she was afraid was incorrect. The longer she dwelled on what was standing before her, the more her body started to shut down from terror. Her lungs refused to pull in air. Her heart felt ready to explode and her blood felt like ice in her veins. She was almost high on fear. Very good, nodded Thade. I am that which walks with all life. My voice is a death rattle, A last breath in the throat, the last whisper of a dying man. The light was leached from vision. The space between air became gray, the colors became monochrome, and the shadows became an impenetrable black. As the darkness lifted him into the air, Thade's body was entrapped by armor, intricately designed to resemble a human skeleton. A tattered gray robe with the hood pushed back appeared on his shoulders, leaving only the rib cage-adorned breastplate visible. He looked upon them, and his eyes were the color of the end of all things. Greetings. He smiled easily. I am Death. It was about this point that Sona ceased to blame Issei for running when he had the chance. She would have done the same. She experiencing the curious sensation that few live to tell about, wherein one's every nerve screams at them for either fight or flight, but at the same time leaves you certain that if you do, you die. You appear to be intimidated, Miss Citri, smiled the Grim Reaper. Clearly, you have phenomenal instincts. I am about to kill you, after all. One of them asked why. None of them knew who. Why? He cocked his head, that same bemused smile dancing across his lips. Because I hate Issei Hayadu. Sona stayed frozen as the scythe appeared in his hand. Her muscles remained locked as the blade whistled toward her. Her peerage gathered around her like a herd of deer in front of a speeding train. Time seemed to slow down as the weapon came closer. A lump of Issei meat near his foot twitched. It was all the warning he got before it erupted into a huge spike of sharpened matter. As Death dodged out the way, canceling his attack as he did so, other such chunks about the room did the same. Soon spikes were flying at him from every direction as he ducked and spun about the room. By the time he finally came to rest at the opposite end from the Citri group, they had filled the air with a spider web of pointy death, the most jagged and frightening of which all coming from Issei's abandoned lower half. With the attempt at murder averted and the Reaper separated from the devils, Issei's body mass began to fuse back together. The black needles dissolved into liquid flesh and flowed together, reforming into a humanoid figure. When Sona teleported away before he finished, Issei didn't blame her. He'd been there. Not cool. He scowled, claws at the ready. They had nothing to do with anything. How dare you? Snarled the horseman. The very sight of the deathling seemed to drive him to homicidal fury. You have done nothing but destroy what is mine since the day we met. And why? My offer to you far more generous than you deserved. If there's one thing pop culture has taught me, it's that selling your soul to a satanic archetype is an incredibly stupid idea. Issei actually sounded a little apologetic as he said this. And what have I destroyed exactly? Well, for starters, you broke my scythe. Correction. You broke your scythe, Issei pointed out. And you clearly had no trouble getting a new one. You also shattered my mask. Death trailed his fingers down his face as he said this. Have you any idea how much I like that thing? The reason people portray me as a skeleton is because they find it less frightening by comparison. It wasn't that bad. You also slaughtered my subordinates, you devoured my hounds, you killed my horse. His voice rose into an enraged scream. You killed my horse. Horses aren't exactly dying out, you know, said Issei dryly. You could just get a new one. He barely dodged as the Reaper's weapon came whistling towards him, gouging a hole into the ground where he'd just been standing. I'm going to enjoy this. If there was any blood left in Issei's body, it would have drained from his face as a second scythe materialized in Death's free hand. Scratch that, I'm going to fucking love it. Claws, Issei found, were not the best weapons with which fight off a dual-wielding scythe user. Although they were ridiculously long, they stood no chance of making it inside the Grim Reaper's range. Often the best he could do was deflect them by striking the flat of the blade. Even then he occasionally took injuries, usually in the form of severed fingers. While he was more than capable of regenerating them, Issei still had a limited amount of body mass from which to draw on. With no mooks from which to replenish it, and an unwillingness to sacrifice any nearby civilians, when it was depleted, then what? The thought was jarring, enough so that Issei was almost beheaded by a lucky swing. Would he die? Or would he continue to exist, trapped in his own dead matter? Even ground to atoms, perhaps he would persevere, devouring microorganisms and gradually working his way up until he was restored to his natural body. Gritting his teeth, Issei decided it didn't matter. He would not die today. Between them, Death and the dead man had minced most of the furniture into splinters as they danced across the room. They were at a stalemate, but only until Issei's endurance ran out. His claws were fast, but lacked power. He needed a better weapon if he was going to. Issei blinked. Maybe he already had one? His claws had developed after consuming a hellhound, and by now he had eaten several other bizarre monsters besides. He remembered the rogue devil he devoured the previous night. In particular, he remembered her immense claws, each individual talon a weapon in their own right. As the image solidified in his mind, his flesh began to quiver, flickering along his arms. A lot had happened since their last encounter, so both combatants were surprised by the blast. The suddenness that seemed to accompany every new transformation forced the air outwards, the small sonic boom blowing the pair apart. Each of Issei's arms had now formed into wicked curved blades. At their broadest they were wider than his torso, incredibly hard and sharp despite being formed from flesh. They both stared at the appendages in shock for a few moments, before a vicious grin curled across Issei's lips. In a blur of flashing aggression he engaged the Reaper in round 2, this time on far more even ground. While the increase in range and power weren't enough to put him at an advantage, it certainly evened the footing. The clashing of their blades was now so destructive that parts of ceiling had begun cave in. The falling debris shredded before they even noticed it. With a snarl, Death lost patience. He kicked the Deathling across the room before cocking back one arm. With a roar, his right scythe was hurled spinning forward. It narrowly missed as Issei dodged, causing a light breeze against his pallid skin. He noticed too late the chain connecting the weapon to Death's hand. With a roar he pulled it back, reversing the scythe's flight impossibly quickly. Issei was very glad he no longer felt pain as it whipped past, severing his arm in the process. He impaled the severed limb with his remaining blade, roughly reattaching it as Death threw his second scythe. Issei jumped over it, only to find the first coming at him from the opposite direction as he hung helpless in midair. The insane movements actually reminded him of the prehensile tail of the rogue devil. Shame he didn't have one of those. A second sonic boom blew the weapons away, the sudden evolution of his arms as unexpected to Issei as it was to his opponent. His hands now had 4 fingers, each of them a sharp, reflective blade. His arms were now formed from dozens of interlocking tubes, wrapped tightly together in parity of muscle. Issei found he knew what they were for as soon as they appeared. Issei threw one open fist forward in a punch, the elastic wires in his arms unraveling as the blades cut through the air. Death swung one side by its chain to block, but the dead man's other hand was already swooping in from another direction. Soon what was left of the house was being annihilated as their weapons clashed, whip against chain in a dizzying storm of flesh against metal. Issei sighed in resignation as his eyes helpfully developed kinetic vision in response. Taking his body's evolution into his own hands, Issei flexed his shoulders. In a flash, blades sprouted from opposite sides of each arm, forming long rows of streamlined fins down their length. The next time he clashed with Death's scythes, Issei yanked hard on his whips. With a metallic shriek of metal against metal, the chains shattered. Catching one of the terrifying weapons in each hand, Issei withdrew his whips for just a moment before throwing both at his enemy. Death narrowed his eyes as his own scythe spun towards him. Issei had launched his whips immediately after, and the bladed hands at the end were approaching rapidly from his left and right. He stepped back, narrowly avoiding the spike of biomatter that erupted from the ground. Issei had stabbed one foot into the floorboards, extending his mass through the ground in a sneak attack. Death grabbed the spike with one hand, hauling it upward. A long line was ripped through the ground as Issei's leg was uprooted, the whip fist thrown of course as Issei himself was pulled along helplessly. With a roar, he was slammed back down into the ground. This was all done so quickly that it was only now Death reached up and caught his flying scythes. He threw them both forward once more before disappearing in a flash of purple light, reappearing at Issei's 6. The Deathling in the process of standing up was punted like a football, his arms and legs each severed by one of the scythes. Death's hair fluttered in the wind as he allowed them to fly past, embedding in the remains of the wall behind him. Issei screamed and thrashed on the ground, not enough body mass left to regrow his amputated limbs. Panicking from fear rather than pain, it resembled the death throes of a large gray maggot. Issei increased his struggles as the Grim Reaper approached. He walked slowly, clearly savoring the moment. I'm going to take my time with you. Issei stopped screaming as death grabbed him by the throat, lifting him without effort into the air. I'm usually not one for torture, but I'm afraid it's going to take some lateral thinking before I can put you down for good. Not to worry though. Everything that exists can die. Every living thing has a weapon against which there is no defense. Time. Disease. Iron. Guilt. But I'm not a living thing, am I, dipshit? Death scowled, but Issei didn't hear his response. Unfortunately, his body had become far too used to weaponizing the DNA of the rogue devil for its own good. A hat trick was incoming. Issei went very still as a burning sensation appeared in his stomach. No! Not this! Anything but this! The sensation traveled up through his diaphragm. Not the nipples! Not the nipples! Through his throat. Not the weight. What? With a gargle, Issei blew his acidic lunch monkeys into Death's face, dissolving his own jaw and the front of his throat in the process. Death, who had his mouth open, threw him away in pain and disgust, screaming and clawing at his face. That a Lovecraftian abomination had yarked on him was bad enough, but the bubbling green substance that had previously occupied the rogue devil's breasts was so corrosive that you couldn't even see it working. Wherever it landed was a hole, shaped like a splatter of puke. The fact that it could only scorch Death's skin was actually pretty impressive. Issei almost chundered again, but he had reabsorbed his severed limbs after he landed on them and was now mostly regenerated. Ugh, he groaned, rubbing his new lips in revulsion. Never again. He blinked as one of the rogue devil's memories filtered through his mind. Memories of the acid being not only corrosive, but also flammable. Explosively so. A gun belonging to one of the exorcists was lying on the near his right foot. Although Issei had no light powers, Downa Siege and Kalawanna's DNA meant he could use light-powered exorcism tools with ease. He picked it up, pointed it at the screaming horseman, and pulled the trigger. The resulting explosion was straight out of a die-hard movie. One by one the windows burst, glass flying like shrapnel as fire erupted from within. With most of the walls and ceilings destroyed, the blast hit the roof full force, sending it flying straight into the air and out of sight. The walls of the building shattered, and by the time the fire cleared there was just an uneven bed of burning rubble. Issei had long since made his getaway through the smoke. After a few minutes a part of the X-house shifted, the debris pushed aside as a white figure rose dizzily to his feet. Casting his eyes over the battlefield, his look of sleepy-eyed confusion gave way to one of wide-eyed bafflement. "The hell happened while I was out cold?" said Fried. His breath caught in his lungs as he was suddenly grabbed by his lapels. The tall, dark figure looked him in the eye. Even Fried, twisted and depraved as he was, cringed at the sizzling burns and melted skin that composed his face. "Take me to your master, dog of the fallen," snarled Death. "We have a mutual foe in dire need of suffering." Meanwhile, in the part of Issei's subconscious that his active mind had no control over, his body analyzed its own stomach. Logically, it was obsolete. All digestive functions were now performed by Issei's skin. Turning it into a makeshift acid sac should have been a perfectly valid evolutionary choice. But here Issei was, traumatized, and for once by something other than the loss of innocent life. Clearly errors had been made. Without him even noticing, Issei's stomach once more began to transform. Now no longer connected to his intestines and closer to a gland than anything else, a gland it decided to remain. Its new form was not borrowed from an assimilated prey nor based on any other organism Issei had ever heard of. Instead, Issei's subconscious drew inspiration from a haphazard remark during his conversation with Sona, a remark concerning the status of his stolen memories. Something about a hive mind. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the Vergil Creiger for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. If you like to hear adult version of this and other stories, I'll give you link of my Patreon. See you in the next video. Goodbye.